On June 9, 2021, El Salvador became the first country in the world to use Bitcoin as legal tender, making it El Salvador's official national currency, replacing the US dollar. The man behind this move was El Salvador's new young leader, Nayib Bukele, who vowed to restore and evolve the country's economy. Bukele was hailed by many as a transformer and believed that it's time that El Salvador was being led by a visionary. At times of high inflation and volatile markets, this move by Bukele could be the worst economic decision in the country's history. This adoption has been criticized both internationally and within El Salvador due to the high volatility of Bitcoin, its environmental impact, and lack of transparency regarding the government's fiscal policy. The International Monetary Fund put a stop to a $1.3 billion loan to El Salvador, citing Bitcoin's volatility. El Salvador is drowning in debt, and Bitcoin was viewed as a way to encourage foreign investments. 70% of El Salvador's population have no access to regular financial services, and Bitcoin was viewed as the solution. However, cryptocurrencies are very volatile and they cannot be tied to a country's economy. Bukele made a huge mistake in making such a declaration, and it will cost the country a lot. Question is, why did Bukele choose Bitcoin to become the country's national currency, and how did this decision fail Bukele and worsen the country's economy further? Before we answer these questions, let's first go over how the US dollar became El Salvador's national currency before being replaced by the almighty Bitcoin. If you enjoy videos like this, leave a like and subscribe to see similar upcoming content. El Salvador actually had its own currency called the Salvadoran Colon. The colon was the official currency of El Salvador from 1892 until it was replaced by the US dollar on January 1, 2001, when the Legislative Assembly of El Salvador passed the Monetary Integration Act under the administration of former President Francisco Flores. The act authorized the free circulation of the United States dollar in El Salvador, and removed the colon from circulation. The purpose of using the US dollar in El Salvador was to achieve financial stability by encouraging foreign investment and decreasing transaction costs of international trade. However, the government was unable to control monetary policy after the dollarization, as the value of currency was tied to the United States Federal Reserve. Then President Francisco Flores fixed the exchange rate of 8.75 colons for $1, but this only decreased the purchasing power of the people. For example, someone who earned 875 colons went on to receive $100, when the equivalent of their salary before the measure was over $200. In practice, the population have lost half of its purchasing power in just overnight. El Salvador was left without its own monetary policy to react to crises, and they are linked to the decisions of the United States Federal Reserve. The dollarization also slowed down El Salvador's exports because it could not compete against the undervalued currencies of other developing countries such as China. The lack of financial literacy harmed the population of El Salvador, since they did not know how to use the US dollar, nor understood its value. With dollarization, the government promised the arrival of abundant investments, more exports and quality jobs that eventually all never came. Here came Bitcoin. In 2019, a small village in El Salvador named El Zonte adopted Bitcoin as a payment following a donation of $100,000 worth of Bitcoin from an anonymous donor. The donation came with the stipulation that the village adopt a circular economy based on Bitcoin. Many residents in El Zonte did not have access to banking services, and accessed Bitcoin through mobile devices and Bitcoin ATMs in commercial areas. The village has since become known as Bitcoin Beach, and has been cited as an example of using cryptocurrency as legal tender by advocates of Bitcoin. Current president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, wanted to emulate the village's adoption of Bitcoin nationally. Bukele won the presidential elections on February 2019. The 41-year-old became the first candidate to win the presidency since the end of the Salvadoran Civil War who did not represent either of the major two parties. On the 5th of June 2021, Bukele announced that he planned to introduce a bill to the Legislative Assembly which would make El Salvador the first nation to make Bitcoin a legal tender, and it came into effect on the 7th of September 2021. The World Bank had rejected a request from El Salvador to assist with the implementation of Bitcoin as legal tender, citing concerns over transparency and the environmental effects of Bitcoin mining. Nevertheless, Bukele went ahead and enforced Bitcoin circulation. They contracted Athena Bitcoin, which is a company that sells Bitcoin ATMs, to install 1,500 cryptocurrency ATMs where people are able to exchange the US dollar for Bitcoin, or vice versa. Bukele also introduced new measures to incentivize Bitcoin investments. Under the new law, transactions in Bitcoin are not subject to capital gains tax, and foreign Bitcoin investors who invest over 3 Bitcoins in the country are eligible for permanent residence. Fast forward a year after the adoption of Bitcoin, economic surveys found that cryptocurrency was not even widely used in El Salvador, due in part to a lack of digital literacy. In other words, Bukele's vision of reviving the country's economy by switching to Bitcoin was nothing but a disaster. Thousands of protesters gathered in the capital city San Salvador to protest the adoption of Bitcoin. The cause of these protests was concern over a lack of transparency and the use of tax dollars to purchase Bitcoin. Also, Bitcoin's volatility would introduce unnecessary risk and instability to El Salvador's underdeveloped economy. It's also important to note that Bitcoin's anonymity would make it easier to engage in money laundering and criminal activities. In January 2022, the International Monetary Fund urged El Salvador to cease using Bitcoin as legal tender, citing its risk to the country's financial stability, integrity and consumer protection. The IMF advised that the continued use of Bitcoin would make it less likely that the institution would grant El Salvador a previously discussed loan of $1.3 billion. Global lenders don't want to throw money at a country that is spending millions in tax dollars on a cryptocurrency whose price is prone to extreme volatility. Moreover, the switch to Bitcoin had made transferring money more difficult for many Salvadorans rather than easier as had been promised, because the fees associated with the Bitcoin transactions were several times as expensive as traditional transfers. A poll published by the Central American University in September 2021 found that 9 out of 10 of Salvadorans did not have a clear understanding of what Bitcoin was, and 67.9% disagreed with the decision to adopt it as legal tender. A survey published in March by the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of El Salvador found that 86% of businesses have never made a sale in Bitcoin, and only 20% of businesses take Bitcoin. Bitcoin has lost about 60% of its value since the experiment started, and the country still faces plummeting economic growth and a high deficit. In a nutshell, this experiment came out to be a great failure. The Bukele government has spent more than $100 million buying Bitcoins, which are now worth less than $50 million. Bukele's misunderstanding of Bitcoin, and economics more generally, has been demonstrated repeatedly. The Bitcoin plan has adversely affected El Salvador's credit rating and relations with the International Monetary Fund. International credit rating agencies has downgraded El Salvador's credit rating due to concerns about its Bitcoin policies. It seems that the Bitcoin experiment is failing as much as the US dollar experiment. The US dollar failed in growing the economy and reducing debt because the government had no control over the exchange rate. This story is again now being repeated because Bukele cannot control cryptocurrency as they are extremely volatile. Even though cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin might prove itself as a valuable asset in the long run, its volatility makes it difficult to make it a national currency for any country. Many cryptocurrency advocates are applauding Bukele on being the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as a national currency, but on what expense? Let me know in the comments section if you believe cryptocurrencies will ever be fit to use as a national currency, or should countries continue to print its own currency.